right, well, welcome everyone. We are gathered here to pay tribute to the memory of one of Wabash's most respected teacher scholars, William Norwood Brigance. For 38 years, he taught Wabash men, and he shaped the field of rhetorical studies through his scholarship. He was the editor of the pioneering two-volume set, The History and Criticism of American Public Address, author of numerous public speaking textbooks, and a prolific contributor to journals in the field of speech for more than 30 years. In addition, he was also the president of the Speech Association of America, and he led the profession through the post-war expansion years when communication studies really took off as a field. In honor of his memory, family, friends, and former Wabash students have made generous contributions to make this annual event possible. The Brigance Forum is a fund formed by friends and family of Norwood Brigance to bring to campus practitioners and scholars of the art of rhetoric. Since 1988, we have done just that, beginning annually in 1991. And we are so fortunate this evening to have Dr. Brigance's grandson with us, Jack Ost, and we thank him for attending. And we thank his family for their continued support of the practice of rhetoric at Wabash College. I'd like now to introduce our Brigance Forum lecturer, Dr. Celeste Condit. Dr. Condit is a distinguished research professor from the University of Georgia. She did her undergraduate work at Idaho State University and her master's and PhD work at the University of Iowa in rhetorical studies. Her research focuses on the use of rhetorical analyses to explore the role of discourse in the processes of social change and stability. She's explored issues of genetics and health, representation, and her current research focuses on understanding how the individual biological inputs to communication interface with the social and material inputs, especially in regard to pathos. Dr. Condit has won several major awards from the National Communication Association, that same association that Norwood Brigance led when it was called the Speech Communication Association, the Speech Association of America. She's won the Marie Hoffmuth-Nichols Award for Outstanding Scholarship in Public Address, the Douglas Erlinger Distinguished Rhetorical Scholar Award, and was elected a National Communication Association Distinguished Scholar. She's been awarded numerous grants from organizations like the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Health, and the National Center for Human Genomic Research. She's authored books and book chapters, more than 100 research articles, and many of these our students are familiar with because they're considered essential reading for undergraduates and graduates of rhetorical studies. As I was thinking about how to introduce Dr. Condit tonight for the Brigance Forum Lecture, I found myself drawn to an essay that Dr. Condit recently published on the 100th anniversary of the development of the founding of the Speech Communication Association. At that time, it was a Speech Teachers of America Association. In her essay, Dr. Condit articulated a robust future for the field of rhetorical studies, where students and scholars will not be afraid to tackle challenging research questions in innovative ways that address humanity's complex circumstances. She wrote, "The current and near future responsibilities of the humanities is to interpret the broad scope of knowledge produced in the academy for other parts of it and for humanity at large, which is to say, for many different humanities. A major purpose of our interpretive efforts should be to imagine some better feasible horizons towards which to aim collective efforts and to generate tools for moving humans along trajectories towards those horizons." No matter what topic she's turning her rhetorical analyses to, Dr. Condit is truly an exemplar of how rhetorical studies and the humanities not only fit into the liberal arts and into the understanding of knowledge, but can work with other fields to improve our future. The very sort of scholarship that Dr. Condit has encouraged, and the very sort of tradition that Norwood Brigance would have, I feel, very approved of. We are honored to have Dr. Celeste Condit as the Brigance lecturer this year, and please join me in welcoming her for her talk, How Human Anger Routines Shaped 9/11.
Thank you, Sarah. for that very lovely, warm, supportive introduction. And thank all of you. It's been a delightful day here getting to reconnect with Wabash. I first came here 37 years ago and spent a year here with my husband. I married a young man from Wabash. And I knew from that that Wabash was a very special place. So when Dr. McDornan called me and invited me to do this lecture, I was absolutely delighted. Not only because I too had been taught Norwood Brigance's work when I was a student, but also that I expected that I would have a very special opportunity to reconnect with this very special place, and I've really been delighted today to have that opportunity. I'm very grateful that you've come out this evening to share with me a chance to think about some issues that are very challenging for the world today, and to try to put our heads together a little bit to put multiple disciplinary insights together to think about maybe how we might address these issues in somewhat different ways and hopefully in productive ways. I'm going to try to convince you that anger is a kind of human phenomena that organizes human social groups and that sets trajectories for those groups. In the last century or two, scholars have thought very hard about things like social structure. How does social structure organize societies? How do various phenomena like nation states organize societies? And how do other cultural factors organize societies? And those are all extremely important. But one of the issues that I think people are beginning to rethink is the fact that human beings have a set of kind of inbuilt predispositions, we call them emotions, that actually were designed to produce certain kinds of social effects and that have repetitive social effects upon human beings, whether or not we recognize them and whether or not our ideologies are the same or different. And so I want to talk about those today. First, what I'll do is try to present an overview of human emotions and especially anger. And then I want to work through a case study which comes from 9/11. I'll spend most of my talk looking in some depth at Osama bin Ladens rhetoric surrounding 9/11. But then I'll try to show you the ways in which President Bush, representing America, but also a particular political ideology, and also Susan Sontag, representing a very different political ideologies, rhetorics all shared similar and non-productive from a global perspective features because of the drive that anger encourages humans to follow. So to start, I want to talk about the social functions that anger can serve. And when we say anger is productive, a lot of people say, oh, you know, anger's not good, or at least the other person's anger is not good, right? It's a socially destructive force. But several people have argued that anger has very intentional, deliberate, productive social actions. And one of those social actions is more challenging than the other. The more challenging one is anger directed at outgroups. And we may inherit this, or at the very least we share this with other animals, especially other primates. These are threat displays, anger that is directed to threaten another person or another group, and to rally our group to act against that group. And we can see that in some perspectives as constructive, at least for a group, right? But we also can see some of the negative aspects of that kind of rallying. But internally to a group, anger can have very important social functions. And that social function is to adjudicate the relationships between the members in the group. People will say it's resource allocation, and I think that's true, but resource allocation gets done through normative processes. We have a sense of what's normative for allocating resources in our group, and I would argue we also have moral components to that. It's not just resource allocation that is at stake. So the first person who really put this together in a systematic way was an anthropologist. Catherine Lutz was studying a group of people on a coral atoll in the Pacific, and she observed that anger seems to fall out of having these kinds of steps. You have someone who, you have someone who has the belief that there's been a rule, a social rule or value that's violated, and that's pointed out by them. They call for the condemnation of the person who has committed that, and they do that through an anger display. And that is supposed to make the person who is the object of this anger fearful, and that's supposed to make them change their behavior in line with the norms. Now, of course, sometimes that happens, and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, what we typically see in those groups is we call in a third party to adjudicate. Friends, elders, or when the situation is really severe, the tribal chiefs come in and adjudicate this display of anger. Now, because she's an anthropologist, she thought this was fairly unique to this culture. But if you think about it and look around you, you begin to see that this is not so unusual. It's not unique to those people. You see it in the displays of anger that happen around us all the time. And in fact, the evolutionary psychologist Michael argues, Peterson, that anger is a moral emotion. He argues there are other moral emotions, for example, compassion. But the function of anger is designed to manage social rule violations, and the elicitation of anger leads to expressions of blame and support for punishment of rule violators. So even though he gets to it from a different place than Lutz, he ends up with this similar conclusion, that anger is actually something we use to regulate our relationships with each other in groups. When we get to the international context, and that's what I'm keenly interested in because we have many challenges in the international context, as you all know, the two functions, the two ways of using anger conflict with each other and cause problems. The boundaries between we and they in the international conflict are malleable, they're debatable. On the one hand, we are a global community of humanity now. What one group does affects other groups around the world. We can't escape that. And so in one sense, we're all a we. And so we make anger displays that are globally supposed to mean something, okay? Bin Laden's attack on the United States was, in a sense, an anger display that was supposed to bring about an adjudication of something he thought of as a normative violation. But on the other hand, his view of us was as a they. Our view of him is as a they, right? And so we're not necessarily sticking with that in-group way of adjudicating. We're moved to the threat displays. And so we also may not have shared norms. As I talk about it, we'll see, and you probably already know, that there aren't necessarily shared norms that he's appealing to for us in this threat display. So we kind of get mixed up in our roles or uses of these when we come to an international context. And it turns out that's going to be a very difficult problem for humanity, I think, to disentangle. To dive into this a little bit more deeply, we want to think about what makes up an emotion. Okay, so if we're going to see how this works and we're going to try to disentangle it and think about solutions, we need to see what makes up an emotion. So I'm going to start with psychologists. And psychologists more or less agree that there are 4 components to emotions. We won't talk too much about the first one. The first is your subjective your subjective feeling. What do I feel like when I'm angry? What do I feel like when I'm sad? That's not as important for us directly when we're thinking about an international context, so I won't spend much time on that. Similarly, when we're angry, things happen in our bodies, right? All kinds of hormones get kicked off, different brain patterns happen, and so that is part of what it means to have an emotion. More important on the international stage and on the social stage generally are the next 2 elements, and I'll spend a lot of time on those. Appraisal cues, those are the things we look out at in our situation, and we decide, this and this and this, therefore I'm angry. Okay, those are the appraisal cues. And then action tendencies. It turns out emotions make us want to do certain kinds of things. So this, right, is different from this, okay? The action tendency of anger is forward and attack, okay? The action tendency of fear is withdrawal and making myself small. And those are fairly durable tendencies for human beings. And so we want to look at those in a little more detail with anger. So with regard to anger, the appraisal cues for anger are first, something bad happened. Psychologists call it a negative valence, okay? Some kind of harm was done to me. Blockage of my goals, they'll say. Secondly, there's a violation of a moral or social norm, and this usually has 2 components. First, you did it on purpose, okay? It's deliberate, okay? And secondly, I didn't deserve it. According to our moral normative structure, I didn't deserve it. Because if I deserved it, it's not really a moral normative violation, right? Finally, it's remediable. You can fix it. I can be fixed. I can be brought around. I can give restitution, or I can stop doing that in some way. And if that's not the case, either we'll go to fear, okay? Your emotion will become fearful instead of angry, or it'll become hate. I'll want to exterminate you. You cannot be fixed, so I'm going to wipe you out. All right, with regard to the action tendencies, not surprising if you think about it, anger, heightened activity, right? If you get sad, you get stilled, right? But if you get angry, you get aroused. Narrow cognition, this is a little bit more surprising. What we find in anger is that our mind narrows. We go to a rote kind of cognition. We want to repeat the things that we've done already. We go to stereotypical thinking. This is in contrast, for example, to happiness. Happiness is actually a very imaginative emotion, okay? When you're happy, you're more likely to be imaginative. When you're fearful, it turns out you're more likely to search for information. But when you're angry, you shut down. Let's go to the rote routines and just do what we have been doing and keep doing that. Not surprisingly, anger is antagonistic. We have an approach orientation. And is it violent all the time? Well, it's not violent all the time. Most of our anger is not violent. But there's always the penumbra of violence in the background. Violence is the end potential in those kinds of attack or antagonistic orientations. On a social level, what this generally means is you're going to rally your group. That's going to be the action tendency. And you're going to seek some kind of punishment. All right? So these are the kinds of things that psychologists tell us happen when people experience anger. However, we also want to attend to what the humanists have learned about anger. And humanists have studied in the last 100 years language very closely in ways that we simply didn't attend to before the 20th century. And Kenneth Burke and others have talked about these linguistic tendencies and how they interact with anger. So absolutism and purification is one of the unique features of language. If you think about it, when squirrels look at nuts, okay, they don't say, oh, that's the best nut ever, okay? They might say, hey, that's a good nut. This one's crappy over here, right? But they don't have that notion of good, better, best. There isn't that that perfectionism without a linguistic system. And so language brings us that. And the intensity of anger and the narrowness of cognition means that that absolutism and perfectionism is pushed forward in an anger situation. Secondly, language is inherently binary. The structure of language, up, down, good, bad, yes, no, right? That's a fundamental underlying structure of language. But language is also beautifully complex. So we can mess things up, all the yeses and nos against each other, right? We can make things very subtle, and we can make things in the middle, right? But anger, again, pushes it apart. It pushes us to the absolutism. It pushes us to binaries that are polar. You know, you're bad, I'm good, all right? Finally, in this 20th century, one of the structures that we pointed out is that language is fundamentally dramatic or dramatistic, some people will say. What that means is that we tend to tell stories. Our language leads us to have this kind of framework. There's an agent. That agent is doing an act. That agent is doing that act for a purpose. They might have an agency, which is some kind of tool. And they're definitely doing it in a particular kind of scene. And a story, a good comprehension of a situation, when I tell you about a situation, we have all those elements and they cohere very nicely. That's a good story, that's a good explanation for a human being. So if we take those tendencies of language and we add them to the psychological elements and we look at the situations in which anger is likely to occur, we get a very typical script to expect. That script says that another, okay, who's depicted through some kind of past that's rote, that's narrow, and that's absolute, okay, has done a harm, and we depict that harm in very amplified terms, not in terms of what actually happened, but in terms of the purpose, because it's got the harms and the purpose and the morals all have to go together. That's unwarranted, we're going to see that those moral warrants tend to get skewed by anger to serve our self-interest rather than to be generalizable. The harm occurred to us, and again, we're going to depict the us through some kind of narrow past affiliation and our current purposes, rather than that kind of imaginative thing we might get in a happy mood where we can strategically think about new options. And, not surprisingly, we have to rally to attack. And attack may mean punish, it may mean conquer, it may mean evict, it may mean exterminate, but whichever one we're picking, we're really sure we're going to get it right. We've got uncautious optimism there. We're going to win. It's going to work. So we expect those kinds of dramas coming out of an anger situation. So I'm going to show you a little bit of how these work, mostly in Osama bin Laden, but then I'm going to try to show you very briefly that the same dynamics go on in Bush and Susan Sontag, even though their ideologies, their goals, and their situations are very, very different. So with regard to bin Laden, I'm going to be talking about translations because I don't speak Arabic. But what I've tried to do to ensure that I'm giving you a good story here, fortunately most of the major texts that bin Laden has done have been translated by multiple translators, and so I've compared the translations to ensure that, as far as I can tell, the translations depict the emotional elements that I'm talking about fairly consistently, and that's the best check I have on that. So who are Osama bin Laden's enemies, right? As Americans, we tend to think we're his enemy, right? That's been our experience, after all, the attack in 9/11 was on us. But if you look across bin Laden's entire career, and if you look at his rhetoric broadly, we're just a kind of one among many, all right? Bin Laden started with his first enemy as being the USSR. He started his career in Afghanistan, fighting the Soviet Union, incursion on that, and he generalized that to all communist nations. He then turned to the USA and Israel, but his primary target through most of his career after the USSR period was Muslim governments throughout the world, but mostly in the Middle East. We think that we were his targets, but if we had gotten completely out of the Middle East, bin Laden would not have stopped, because his goal was to overturn the Muslim governments in the Middle East and to establish a pan-Islamic nation. And so, yes, we were important as a roadblock along the way, but we were just a roadblock along the way to his larger goals. And you cannot understand bin Laden's rhetoric unless you understand that that's a primary agent, that he's a primary enemy. He then, of course, went on to be mad at Europe, the United Nations, and just for good measure, if you look in his discourse, because he's being Quranic, he also is very hostile to the people who are not people of the book, who are idolaters, which, for example, in one of his quotations includes Japan, both Korea, China, and others, okay? So that's a lot of enemies to take on. How do you unify that under one label? Well, the answer is they're infidels, right? The simple single term can capture that whole range of enemies, and anger allows that to be plausible. So, for example, we see this in talking about communists. He says it's ludicrous to suggest that communists are Muslims whose blood should be spared. Since when are they Muslims? Now he's talking about people who are actually self-identified as Muslims in Yemen and Syria, okay? But they're not Muslims to him because they don't believe in his version of Islam, okay? And there's another example. I'm going to race through some of these examples because I always have too much to try to share with you. Now, bin Laden did use a subcategory when it came time to attack the United States, and that subcategory is Crusaders, all right? President Bush got a lot of flack for using the term Crusaders twice. He backed off from the term and said, well, I didn't mean Crusaders with a capital C, I meant it with a little c, right? Bin Laden meant it with a capital C, okay? And I'm just going to show you some tables of all the instances I found of bin Laden using the term Crusader. We don't need to spend all that time reading them, but I just want to show you how many they are, okay? Now, why is the term Crusader interesting, theoretically, in terms of this? Well, if you're looking for a term that's past-oriented, okay? If you're trying to say somebody's mind, through anger, is siphoned into the past, The term Crusader comes from the past, right? It comes from his envisionment of the present completely in the past. So that's one element of the way in which he views the enemy. The other element of absolutism comes in the degree to which he thinks there is no relationship between the enemy and us, okay? He sees this as absolutely two separate groups that the infidels and the Muslims must be absolutely and completely separate. So he says at one point, I would rather die than live in any European state, all right? Muslims are not supposed to be adjacent to non-Muslim societies. Now that's pretty absolute in the non-relationship category, right? At another point he says, if you become friends with Christians or Jews, you become an infidel like them, okay? This is the absolutism of anger, pushing that polarity apart. You can't even be adjacent with these different groups. So that's the enemy. What about his moral warrants? I suggested that anger doesn't allow us to use moral warrants that are truly generalizable across groups. So bin Laden's general principle is not generalizable, I would say not shareable. His moral warrant is based on autonomy, and we think, okay, you know, we're good democratic people, autonomy for religions, that sounds good. But that's not what bin Laden says. He says only his religion has autonomy, right? Only Islam, and only his version of Islam, has the right to have autonomy over a particular territory. That is granted by his version of God, and nobody else gets that right. Right? So it's not a warrant that can adjudicate internationally relationships, right? Because you can't have access to that warrant. Only he can have access to that warrant. The second problem with that is the absolutism of the anger leads him to make demands on his in-group that are so great that there has to be a supplement. And that supplement further warps the moral claim. And I'll show you how that is in the case in a second. First, again, I don't think I need to spend a lot of quotations saying that bin Laden had religious zeal, right? That's not shocking to anybody. So I'm just going to flip through some examples just to show they're there. But I do want to emphasize that the absolutism, again, made the commitment to the moral warrant be absolute, okay? There couldn't just be a war, it had to be an eternal war, okay? So here, for example, he talks about the battles of eternal Islam. He says jihad will go on to the day of judgment, and so on. I think I have, nope, okay. Now, lots of religions have called historically, and especially particular sects, for battle to establish whatever they think is necessary for the religion. Very few have said that war is permanent. Right? That's a real absolute use of that. Similarly, he requires of each person absolute commitment to the jihad now. Okay? Again, many religions ask you to sacrifice for your religion, right? But very few sects say you have to sacrifice all of life now for this battle. And this is what bin Laden calls for. He calls for a life of jihad for the sake of God Almighty. He says getting killed is what we want to do. He says, and this is interesting, and again in my with regard to my emphasis on the fact that he's appealing to Muslims, he's saying to them, look, the Muslim countries you're in now won't let you fight a jihad. They won't let you support my version of Islam. So you have to emigrate. You have to leave and come to Afghanistan for the sake of God and find a place to raise the banner of jihad. All right? So this is an absolute requirement that you give up everything for the religion. So we wouldn't be surprised if we had to have some sugar to sweeten that demand a little bit, right? And the sweetener that you find when you look in there is extensive appeals to status. Now, it's not surprising he's trying to attract young men. Young men have high needs for status rewards, and so it's not surprising that that's what we see in there. But we see huge quantities of status appeals. We'll look at some more of them in detail in a minute, but there's insult, there's pride, there's humiliation. This is what you are appealed to on an individual level. And again, this occurs in lots of cultures. You'll hear President Bush making some honor appeals. The quantity of it is what makes it, I think, distinctive in bin Laden's rhetoric, and there's a lot of quantity. All right. Well, this has implications for the story he can tell about who we are, we as a Muslim community. And it's not a very good one, but it's one we see playing out in ISIS today. Bin Laden says that the relationship is a slave-like hierarchy of the people in Islam. He says, I witness there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his slave and prophet. He says, we have pledged slavery to God Almighty alone. Now, this is distinctive to Bin Laden and some of the associates that he travels with. This is not Quranic. If you search the Quran for the use of slaves, there are slaves because the Quran was written in a time when there was slavery. But you do not see the relationship among Muslims represented as a slave-like hierarchy. And throughout you see Bin Laden, even when he's not using the word slave, that it's a command and obey relationship. It's an absolute force-based set of relationships. And as I said, you see that in the relationships that the Taliban is using at the time. Later, ISIS now uses that kind of command, and they use very similar rhetorics. It is, as I suggested, propelled by the absolutism of these moral warrants and by the need to provide status sweeteners for the people who are going to engage in them. It's also compelled by the fact that when you make anger your primary mode of address, you are making violence a very primary mode, and when you're absolute about it, you're going to make violence the fundamental set of relationships among people. Now, in fairness, it's also, in Bin Laden's case, due to two specific kinds of things that are unique to his case. First, he's in exile, and if you're going to get your rhetoric heard above the usual din and recruit fighters, you probably have to up the ante. Okay, so his rhetoric is as absolute because of that. And secondly, it's a religious rhetoric. And Kenneth Burke says, religion is the wordiest of words. And what he means by that is that the potentials in language are most fully exemplified in religious discourse. And we could talk about why that is, but I think he's correct about that. That doesn't mean that religion is always like Bin Laden, right? What it does mean, however, is that when religious rhetoric takes on anger, that's the place where anger could have its maximum potential. And in Bin Laden, we see that maximum potential being enacted. So what effect does this have on the harms that Bin Laden portrays? On what he says, you know, he's the basis of harms that he's saying we have justifies his actions, not only in 9/11, but he's done similar actions around the Middle East, in Middle Eastern countries before this. Well, if you look at his discourse, he's not going to allege that the harms are primarily death and destruction. He'll refer to those. But he's going to mention that the harms are in terms of those moral warrants he's given us. They're in terms of the status of individuals, honor, and in terms of the violation of religion. And I want to give an example from his justificatory appeal of the 7th of October, 2001. Because this speech, I think, is my best kind of counter case evidence. You can't explain Bin Laden's statement without this kind of analysis that I'm doing. And this is the address that he gave, the first address he gave after 9/11. That's kind of a public justification. He doesn't own up that he was involved in 9/11, but he kind of says, you know, 9/11 was great, right? And so this was picked up by Al Jazeera and then published in lots of newspapers around the world after that. The interpretations of this have been completely confused in my view because people have read it in terms of the United States, okay? And the BBC, for example, calls this Bin Laden's warning. Well, the last two sentences do indeed have a warning, but that's it. The whole rest of the talk, or the whole rest of the statement, is focused on his audience in the Middle East. It's not a warning to the United States. It's an appeal for Muslims to switch alliances. Because what happens after 9/11 is that all of the leaders of the Muslim countries, except, anybody got a guess? Which one? No? Huh? Iraq! Guess who gets it, right? All of the leaders of the Muslim countries, except Iraq, come out in sympathy for the United States, okay? And this is not good from Bin Laden's perspective because he needs hideouts, right? He needs support. And if those governments are siding with the United States instead of with him. This is not according to his long-term agenda, right? I suspect he didn't expect that reaction. And so he's using this address to tell the Muslim people to overturn their governments, and especially the imams who have supported those Muslim governments to change their ways and to support him instead. And you can see that what goes on in this address is not an appeal to self-defense. If you read it from a kind of bin Laden sympathetic US perspective, you'll hear lots of people read this as, oh, well, you know, bin Laden's saying that the US has taken over their territory and therefore the moral warrant is, you know, the United States ought to get out and that's the problem. But you can't read the address that way for reasons that I'll suggest. Instead, what he's going to be doing is say, don't condemn me and ally with the United States on the grounds that I used violence. That's not a valid reasoning because the US is more violent than I am. So that's why he's going to talk about US violence, and I'll show you why we can interpret it that way in a second. Instead, he says, your basis of affiliation should be religion and religion alone. All right, so he's defending his violence by saying, you know, the United States does it worse. Okay, so with regards to this, the very first appeal that he makes in here to harm is an appeal based on honor. The very first time he talks about a harm committed, he says, our nation has been tasting this humiliation and contempt for more than 90 years. So when I say honor is probably more important than bloodshed for bin Laden, one of the reasons is it comes first and most vividly. In the very next paragraph, he does mention blood. Okay, his sons are being killed, his blood is being shed. But of equal weight in that, it's holy places are being attacked, and it's not being ruled according to what God has decreed. So the religious warrant and a bit of defensiveness or honor. In a summary paragraph after this section, we get the three elements: blood, honor, and the holy places of the Muslims. Okay? So you can see that the way in which he's setting up the harm is broader. It's in terms of the moral warrants. It's amplified. It's not about specifics. Now, people would want to point to his mentions of death in Iraq as saying, well, see, this is proof that what he's arguing is that the US has been messing around in Iraq, and you know that's Muslim territory, and therefore they ought to get out. But I say you can't interpret these two sections in that way, because if you know anything about the history of what bin Laden's career was, and people, his Muslim audience in the Mideast would know this, even though we Americans probably wouldn't. The reason, or the time point at which bin Laden becomes a primary enemy of the United States is when Iraq invades Kuwait. Now at this time, he's done against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, so he volunteers his mujahideen as fighters to the Saudi Arabia government, he's Saudi Arabian, to fight the Iraqis. He says, let me go in and kill the Iraqis. And the Iraqis say, probably not going to work. I mean, the Saudi government says, probably not going to work. We're going with the United States, all right? So they invite the United States in to fight Iraq and Kuwait. This really ticks off bin Laden, okay? And this is the point at which he turns against not only the United States, but also his home country of Saudi Arabia. He begins to fight with them. He becomes exiled from Saudi Arabia because of the violent threat he represents to his home government. He moves to Sudan. He threatens these other governments, and eventually he gets Afghanistan's the last place that will take him. So you cannot read this as, you know, gee, this was our territory. Iraq was our territory, right? Because he wanted to invade it too. All you can read it as, they killed a lot of people there too, right? Now, if you don't believe that, there's an even clearer example. Because the next paragraph, he refers to the nuclear bombing of Japan. Now, the nuclear bombing of Japan is not the US invasion of the territory of Muslims. As I showed you in that earlier quotation, he's disavowed Japan. He's not claiming that territory. So you cannot read this as a claim for autonomy, right? This is a claim that the United States is more violent, and so you can't use violence as the basis of which side you're picking. And instead then, he gives us that we must, in the middle section of the speech, make our alliance based on religion. And there's several paragraphs here, sentence paragraphs, that emphasize this at this point, right? So what we see here is a disvalidation of the United States on the basis of its greater violence, and then a move, okay, so what should be your alliance be on? It should be based on religion. And this is his words for him. He doesn't say we, me, I thought. He said these people who declared their faith in God and refused to abandon their religion and so on. But that's, the people in the Middle East know that's bin Laden and his fighters. All right, so he's defined his alliance then in terms of religion. I don't want to read through all these because I think we've gone through them, but I think maybe at this point you'll see that anger defines key content towards of bin Laden's rhetoric. But this has bigger implications because this means that by using anger as his primary motivation, he's used a rhetoric that separates and narrows human groups. And this is even though Islam is otherwise presentable by other people as a connecting and broadening ideology or theology. He's using violence as a motivational structure, which infects the structure within his people as well as the relationships without. And he's organized people on a command and control hierarchy. And what this means is we can't use that kind of rhetoric for adjudicating international disputes. Now, you might say, well, that's a lot of work to get to that conclusion. We do that just from listening to bin Laden, right? But what I want to show is the generality of this structure. And people might say, well, you know, what about somebody else who has different international commitments? If we look at President Bush, we have a very different ideology, right? But it turns out that anger produces the same kinds of absolutism in President Bush's rhetoric. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this just because I'm mindful of your time, but I do want to deal with just one element. I could work through all of these. But I want to deal with the issue of freedom, the moral warrant. Partly because I think you've probably all heard before attacks on President Bush for his use of evil and his polarizing rhetoric and so on. But freedom is very interesting. I think global freedom is a potentially generalizable warrant, right? Some people don't. They don't like that term, but I think we could use that in international commerce, commerce not in the money sense, international commerce in the sense of discussion, as a potentially general warrant. And I think actually President Bush thinks he is. But what happens because of the nature of anger and the dynamics of anger is that he ends up articulating freedom in a US subservient fashion. And there are two ways he does this. First, which freedoms he articulates. So if you look carefully at his speeches, he articulates these freedoms: religious freedom, freedom of dress and movement for women, freedom to choose and use consumer goods. Those are the ones he ends up articulating. Now, I've just contrasted this to FDR's four freedoms: freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion, to emphasize that there are different aspects of freedom that different people in different nations at different times need. For example, if you've been following Aung San Suu Kyi lately and her very hard, long-fought triumph there, her primary emphasis for her people has been freedom from fear because of the situation they are in. And so even if President Bush was trying to advance a vision of global freedom, because he was advancing it from this US perspective, he didn't necessarily advance the sense of freedom that people in this area might have needed. Secondly, and probably even more problematically, if you read the way in which the address on Iraq is written, but also some of the other addresses, and if you read the basis of this in what's called the Cheney Doctrine, which is the kind of international policy doctrine that people argue he based Bush based his presidents on, what he says in what is said in those documents is that freedom is only pragmatically is only where the U.S. believe is in our interests to enforce freedom. So yes, everybody should have global freedom, but who really gets it? Well, we decide, and only we decide, and it's about our enforcement. Well, that's not a shareable warrant for freedom, right? Either freedom is something everybody equally gets to enforce for themselves in the same way, or it's not everybody's, it's just our version of freedom, and it's really then, in that case, just freedom for us. And that's the way that the angry rhetoric ends up, I think, distorting this particular moral warrant. And as I said, he does a lot of the other kinds of things, you know, very polarizing rhetoric of we and they, and so forth as well. So I think he narrows the we to a point that's unworkable in a globalized context. He distorts that moral warrant, and he also motivates global scale violence, which, you know, we've seen, and which arguably was unnecessary maybe in Iraq, even if you thought it was appropriate in another contexts. So that again, I think you could argue that angry rhetoric led him to do things that perhaps were not necessary for his ideology or even desirable for him for the long term. But you can still say, well, Bush is a conservative, bin Laden's a conservative, it's really just conservative ideology that does this, right? So I need to attack my liberal friends, okay? And Susan Sontag has a very different ideology than this group. And I actually have looked at several people who are on the left, and you see several of them are more vivid examples than Sontag is. But Sontag's statement in the New Yorker of September 24th was the one that gathered the most attention. David Talbot said it created the biggest uproar of her life. Daniel Lazar noted that the essay, less than 400 words, unleashed a torrent of right-wing abuse, and it did, which is to say, her rhetoric was unsuccessful. She was unable to rally the American people to the view that she wanted. And that's important because when I talk about Susan Sontag, a lot of my academic audiences get a little bit defensive, and they say, but she was right! And I said, well, that's even worse. Because if she were right, and she failed, then we should want to know why, right? And the answer is, like bin Laden, like Bush, her rhetoric was directed by the dynamics of anger, not just by her ideology, although clearly ideology is part of it. So who were Susan Sontag's enemies in this? Well, it was rote. It was the old enemies. It was the same old enemies, okay? So who are they? A wide spectrum of public officials, public figures and TV commentators, our leaders, our robotic president, the American intelligence and counterintelligence establishment. These are the same enemies that Sontag had been writing against for a long time. 9/11 comes along, bin Laden shoots the towers down, and we've got the same old enemies we've been fighting. If that's not an emphasis on how anger keeps us in our same patterns, I don't know what is. What about us? Who are we? Okay? Now, Sontag says in a later interview, she's trying to whip up the American people to do what she thinks is right? But she doesn't appeal to the American people. She treats them as ignorant, as passive, right? She says they're subject to infantilization. They're unaware. She says, let's not be stupid together, okay? That's not a flattering depiction to get an audience to work together. She says that they don't have any shred of historical awareness. She says they're not being asked to bear much of the burden. Well, if you respect the public, you don't expect somebody to come in and ask them to bear the burden. You expect the public to bear the burden itself. But this is rather an old way of depicting the public and depicting the media's relationship to the public within this rhetoric. And so her us doesn't incorporate the American public that she wants to appeal to. Who is left over for the we? She's not very explicit about it, but by implication, it's we, the smart ones. We, you know, us intelligentsia, we professors, okay? What about the harm, okay? As with bin Laden and Bush, Sontag's anger does not focus on the death and destruction, right? Bush doesn't do this either, okay? He goes to global freedom as the harm. The harm isn't the people being killed, although in the start of each of his speeches he does mention those things. Instead, the harm is recruited to that drama, that story that we want to tell, our purpose terms. She says this was not a cowardly attack on civilization or liberty or humanity or the free world, but an attack on the world's self-proclaimed superpower, undertaken as a consequence of specific American alliances and actions. Well, maybe you think that's true, but that's an odd way to deal with the immediate harm that people are facing on the evening of 9/11. She says it's a monstrous dose of reality. Okay? Again, maybe you agree with that, but depicting that harm in that way rather than what happened that night is a choice influenced as well by anger. What's her warrant? What's her moral warrant? Well, again, this is a short statement, and I get some of this from other sources, and just have to say from other people who, like Noam Chomsky and Edward Said and others who had written similar kinds of texts and longer and more explicit. But if you look at what she valorizes and what she mocks, she has the same warrant, which is understanding. She mocks manipulation, psychotherapy, emotion, stupidity. She valorizes disagreement, candor, reality, historical awareness. And so I think understanding, producing greater understanding is more explicitly the case in other leftist statements, also the underlying one of hers. What about the action tendency? This is the one that's most inconsistent in some ways. She says her most explicit statement of what action we should take is let's not be stupid together. Well, that's not very explicit, right? And it's not surprising. Americans had trouble rallying around not being stupid together. But in the second interview about this statement, the reporter pushes her really hard. Well, what should we do then, right? And that's a reasonable question. And she simply cannot come up with it. She lists several things, but then she says, oh, that won't work. That won't work. Oh, what about this? Well, that won't work. And she finally concludes, well, it's not for me to speculate on this, but there are all sorts of realpolitik outcomes that one can imagine, all right? But she can't imagine them, so I'm not sure who is supposed to be doing them. What she is left with is verbal attack. That's it. That's the action tendency she's left with. And given that that verbal attack is on the American government and indirectly on the American public, the rhetoric doesn't work to serve her goal, which she says is to create greater understanding, to get people to understand the situation in the Middle East better. This is to say that anger serves different goals, different ideologies, better and worse. Even though it works the same in many ways in bin Laden, in Sontag, in Bush, for bin Laden, it's a pretty effective rhetoric, and ISIS is doing it even better, right? For Bush, it works in the short term. It rallies the nation effectively. Perhaps arguably it doesn't work as well in the long term for his goals, if his goals are really global freedom. And I take him at his word that that was his intention. And for Susan Sontag, it doesn't work well at all, right? So regardless of ideology and goal, anger has these negative tendencies, and I'm going to not restate them again. But that means that anger cannot serve its social function of normative adjudication in our current global context. And that's a problem if everybody is moved to anger in response to these kinds of situations. What do we need to do then? I don't want to leave you completely without solutions, but we're out of time, so I'll just point to the fact that I have thought about this, and maybe we can talk about them. One thing you can do is there are alternative emotional strategies to promote social change. And that's particularly true if you're in the Susan Sontag and George Bush camp. There also is a desperate need for us to build global deliberative platforms that will strengthen both our sense of international relationships that and build shared normative warrants. Because if we're going to use any kind of adjudicative mechanism internationally, we have to have those shared normative warrants. And certainly, I don't think we're going to get rid of human anger. So if we're going to use that as a mechanism, it can't work unless we have those shared normative warrants. So I invite your questions and discussion and angry response.
Struck by, and I'm going back a little earlier in the talk, that you talked about the local grounding of moral warrants, and concluding here with this idea that building the we is more global. And I guess I'm curious if there's a local element of that we that also functions on the global level, or is the local really specific to the moral warrant of anger, that personalization.
Yeah, so one of the things that I didn't talk about that's background here, some of my claim there comes from the fact that people have done studies of social justice. And when they do these studies, what they find is that people, if you give a scenario in which somebody is treated unjustly, they will cognitively recognize that as a situation of injustice. But they only emotionally respond with anger if there is self-interest, or self-interest in a broad sense, identification with the victim of the anger. Right? So that presents a little bit of a trouble on this if we always have to have some kind of interested component, right, for global. And I'm not sure exactly how we get over that. Part of it is there is the capacity for identification with people who are different from us, and that works especially in certain kinds of people, and there's also evidence that some people are more prone to that identificatory process than others. Another element, though, is that even though local conditions are local in some sense, many local conditions are replicated analogously elsewhere. And one of my doctoral students has just done research on global MOOCs. And one of the things that she's found is that what happens in global MOOCs is that people from different parts of the world share similar experiences, and those become bases for identification. So it's possible that what we think of as local interest actually isn't as local as we think it is, and that has resonance and analogy globally. And so it's possible that we could see that pattern, and that would solve this potential problem. I actually have this paper on the superflu, and at the end of that paper I argue in Poroi, it's a publicly available journal, at the end of the argument that I argue for a platform, for a platform that would have these kind of features, that we need to initiate it, and I argue that the World Health Organization is the right organization to do this on an experimental basis for a variety of reasons, and it needs to be experimental. I mean, I'm very concerned about, I don't want a one world government. You know, I mean, one powerful government is bad, make it universal. So we have to kind of do this experimentally to see how we can build these things. But that's a place we would find experimentally whether the problem of self-interest is unovercomable because it's truly local, or whether the analogy function would work or not. But yeah, you've gone right to one of the concerns. Yeah. Yes?
I'm curious what you think of President Obama, that is no drama Obama, right? And his response to the recent Brussels terrorist attack, for example, in Cuba, where he was widely criticized for not showing anger and shaking the saber rattling. And I'm curious whether you think, what are the alternatives to anger for solidifying leadership or being a leader?
Yeah, so that gets to option number one, and a couple of possibilities. One is we can show anger, but be deliberate about what the anger wants us to do and guard against those negative tendencies. I think that's possible politically. I mean, I think we can say, okay, anger's going to make me want to be absolute about having a war, because I didn't get to deal with this, that nation states, when they're angry, the logical, the coherent, the past, and also in terms of scope, the way the drama works out, the logical thing is a war. How do nation states attack? They have a war, right? And you can say, okay, anger's going to lead me that, but since I understand anger, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm not going to let it close down my options. I'm going to point to an action tendency that would be more productive. So that's one way, is to rechannel our anger, understanding the negative tendencies of anger. The second thing is to use another emotion. So, for example, with Susan Sontag's address, I experiment with two different possibilities. What would her address have looked like if she'd used sadness instead? Because sadness has the disadvantage of that it's a little stilling and it's a little bit individualizing, but it's another one of those emotions that's open to information seeking. And so if her goal is to get understanding, sadness might be a better emotion for her than anger. And so that might be, something Obama might have wanted to explore. Okay, they want me to show anger, instead I'm going to show sadness. And one of the problems, not only for Obama, but this is true of You know, look at Democrats. Gore, Dukakis, you know, they're part of that ideology that emotion is bad, and so we're just pure intellect. But humans aren't pure intellect. And in fact, there's all these lovely studies now in psychology that show that human beings who have their emotions disengaged actually make really terrible decisions. That our decision process is innately linked up with our emotional process. And so that goal that came out of the Enlightenment, in some ways, privileging of rationality and so on, turns out to have been wrong. Computers are great at rationality. They're really impossible at emotion. So what we need is reflection on our emotion and better emotion rather than, as you say, no drama at all. So we should think of it as a contest of which emotion is best for the human community in drama instead of get rid of emotion because it's bad. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes?
Does it make any difference for the dynamics of this, whether somebody's speaking out of anger or speaking to an angry audience?
Yeah. Yes and no. One of the things that's interesting about President Bush is he actually starts with an audience that is in shock, which is stage 1 fear, technically, and he channels that into anger. And so because of that, there are some dynamics that go on about what the audience emotion is that's different than his emotion. But one of the things, the complexities that I couldn't address is that one of the interesting things about emotion is it's not linear in the sense of first you have the appraisal, then you feel the subjective, then you feel the physiology, and then you do the action tendency. That would be kind of our old model. It's a complex, and it turns out any place you start in the complex can activate the whole complex, and this is why those early experiments, you may all remember them from psychology, where they aroused people in certain kinds of ways biochemically, and then different people thought they were feeling different emotions, right? It's because, you know, the complex is a complex. And so what that means is, as a speaker, I have to feel this to arouse it, or at least look like I feel it, and pretty much you have to feel it to arouse it unless you're a really great actor, and we've had at least one president who's probably that good, but you have to feel it to share it, to have contagion with your audience, and so that absolute separation between what the audience is feeling and what the speaker is feeling isn't necessarily diagnostic or directional. It's that relational thing. Did I answer that? Okay. Yes?
Yeah, so your work here seems to be very applicable to the current political landscape, especially with one particular candidate who has really capitalized on the use of...
I was afraid somebody was going to ask
the use of anger as sort of rhetorical movement, and we've seen that spread to the masses that support him and sort of permeate for the rest of the country. Have you been able to look at any of those relationships based upon the research that you've done here?
Yeah. So let me step back a step. There's a really interesting study that shows that the emotion that travels best on the internet is anger. And that has consequences, I think, for our society. For those of you who are just a little bit older, politics has always had anger in it, but the level of anger that we see in politics now is really, really high. And I think that's because if you want to get heard today in an internet society, you quickly intuitively learn that anger is the emotion that circulates, right? And so political figures, but also news media, right? I mean, we don't have Walter Cronkite anymore, right? We have angry news commentators and even angry news presenters. So I would say that the person you're referring to is probably just a particularly good manifestation of it. And I think he shows us, I mean, you know, I invite somebody on their senior thesis to do a study of how well he uses and manifests anger and how well that spreads to other people. And the downside of this, and now I'm going to just be talking about my politics rather than, I try to kind of, you know, be even-handed among different ideologies in my research. But in terms of my politics, it spreads among people because right now we're in a situation not only where the internet has made this a common emotion, you know, I didn't talk too much about the cultural variations in emotion, but anger is learned, how you do anger is learned, and Aristotle has this lovely typology of what anger is appropriate, how much, how long, at what objects, so on and so forth. You know, he looked at this a long time ago. So you've learned this, and so we've got a whole group of people now who have been exposed to, and I'll make fun of this one person, Rush Limbaugh for a long time, right? So they're much more familiar and comfortable with the anger dynamics. But the global political situation has changed such that, you know, when I was growing up, I had to compete with, you know, people in the United States. My father had to compete with people in Idaho. You know, his father competed with people in Hagerman, Idaho, okay? And so now you're competing with people all around the globe. And this is, if you read Thomas Piketty's book, which I think everybody in Wabash should be familiar with, especially as many econ minors as we have here, really shows that we had this kind of dip, this really fortunate, wonderful dip coming out of World War II, that now we no longer have economically. It does all kinds of things that a specific group of people in the United States are, you know, particularly affected by, and they don't want to hear, tough luck for you, it's a global economy, you're now competing against 7 billion people, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? And so a political leader who says, you know, be angry, and what is the anger formula? Be against this group, they're absolutely bad. Be against that group, attack, you know, that's gonna work in that kind of situation. So the cultural dynamics, the media dynamics, and then the personal needs seem to me to all come together. You're shaking your head, yes. Anything I missed?
I don't think so, thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Okay, so are you willing to now lay out a formula to successfully respond rhetorically to an anger approach used in politics?
Yeah, I mean, that's I wish I had that. I could, I'd run for president. No, not really. I'm not that out of my mind. You know, I think that the approach that certain other candidates have tried to use have been two. One, to get angry back and redirect the anger at different things. That might work, but you might not want it. You know, that might not be a strategy that you might want to work. But I think that's, you know, potentially a strategy that would be efficacious, maybe have longer term consequences you don't want. Whether or not other, you know, consistent other emotions could be more appealing, I don't know. The only hope I have for this, and again, you might not like this politically, but the amazing thing about Bill Clinton as a rhetor is that he always was using positive vision, you know, hope. And I've done a little work on hope, and I'm trying to do more work on how hope works. And it turns out hope's a little complicated. There's two kinds of hope. There's not just one kind of hope, and blah, blah, blah. So I don't have a handle on this. But he was always able to use that repertoire of positive emotions. And if you think about it, the man was impeached. The man was hated. The man was, you know, had all of the most negative things possible said with him. And he goes through this with really strong public approval ratings. And my account of that is that there is a great strength in those positive emotions. And if you think about some other Democratic rhetors who were particularly successful, you know, Kennedy kind of had the hope, positive image thing going. Mario Cuomo never ran for president, but he was a hope candidate. So I don't have the definitive answer to that, but that's one I would try. That, you know, people might actually get onto that. And it doesn't, again, politically, Democrats don't like to go necessarily to that because we like to, you know, wring our hands to, oh, things are terrible and we need to make them better. But maybe that's not the best strategy rhetorically. What ideas you have? Yeah.
Well, I don't have any great ideas about it, but I very much enjoyed your talk at lunch, and you talked about, in part, the issues of how to make a public receptive to a message that they don't necessarily want to hear in the context of science and Ebola and other things.
Right.
So I'm thinking in this context, is there some way to be more inclusive? It's along the happiness and hope theme that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But rather than saying that's them and we're against them, to say, aren't we all part of this? Shouldn't we work together on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great strategy to try, and to try it with a lot of emotional enthusiasm and skill. You know, that's the other thing. You have to be good at this stuff. You know, that's one of the reasons I study it instead of doing it. I'm really good at studying it, I'm good at doing it.
Well, I think that's a great deal of questions, and so we thank you for all your thoughts.